Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Psalm 51, verse 10. My question to you is this: how do we know when we have a right spirit? What does it take to develop the right spirit? And how do we go about? And how do we know when we've arrived? And what does it mean to have a right spirit? I want to talk to us this morning about the right spirit. We've been in a series, Philippians, Finding Joy in the Journey. We've been in this series for quite some time. We only have about 14 more weeks to go. No, we only have one more week to go. It's hard to believe we finally come near to the finish line, and I'm kind of sad. I love the book of Philippians because I think it speaks a lot about having the right spirit, and it helps us a lot about finding joy in the journey. And in our text today, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 10 and following, Paul describes some qualities that I think are absolutely key to having a right spirit and also developing a right spirit in our lives. And so we're going to look at those qualities this morning. Philippians chapter 4, let's begin in verse 10. The Apostle Paul says, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity." Let's go back to the beginning. But I rejoice. There's that word again. That word that we keep tripping over time and time again. Joy and rejoice. Over and over again, the Apostle Paul talks about having joy in our lives, finding joy in the journey, rejoicing. And I believe rejoicing is part of the key to having a right spirit. The Apostle Paul has a thankful spirit. He has an attitude of gratitude. He is rejoicing. If you look back just a few verses, Philippians 4, verse 4, used to sing this song in camp years and years ago. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. The Apostle Paul doesn't just preach it, he practices it. For we see him right now saying, I rejoiced in the Lord. And not just a little bit. He said, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. Now, why? Why is he thankful? Why is he happy? Why is he grateful? Well, the verse tells us. He says, I'm rejoicing, I'm grateful, I'm thankful, because now at last you have revived your concern for me. He says, indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Now, this takes a little bit of context to understand what's going on here. If you read the verses after, I'm going to preach on those next week, verses 14, 15, 16, and following, you will uncover that the Philippian Christians had helped the Apostle Paul financially. As a matter of fact, earlier on, he talked about how they had sent Epaphroditus from the church. He evidently had a monetary gift. They were supporting his missionary efforts. And he says to them, you didn't do it just once. You did it more than twice when I was in Thessalonica. And so this is part of the purpose in writing Philippians. The Apostle Paul is thanking them. This is a thank you letter, if you will, for the gift and gifts that they've been sending him while he's been involved in missionary efforts. He says, at last you revived your concern for me. It's not that you weren't concerned before, he says, but you lacked the opportunity to be able to help me. And so because of that, the Apostle Paul is thankful. He's grateful, and he's rejoicing. Now, I can understand that. I imagine you can too. If you get money in the mail, doesn't that make you have a smile on your face? Hello, I like to receive money in the mail, and he probably got this sent UPS or, FedEx. I'm not sure how it was sent. I think it was fed Epaphroditus. He's the one who carried the money, but he's grateful that he's been helped. Now, right on the heels of that, verse 11, he kind of wants to put in a caveat or a little bit of a disclaimer. He says, not that I speak from want. He says, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. No wonder he does that. He says, thank you. I rejoice in the Lord greatly. I appreciate what you've done. But he wants to make sure that they know, hey, I'm not putting a plug in. I'm not saying this so that you'll send me more money. He says, as a matter of fact, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. And he says right off the bat, I'm not speaking from want. I'm not asking. I'm not begging. I'm not pleading. I'm not speaking about it. I'm not bringing it up because I have a need. I'm not bringing it up because I want you to send me more. There's an important lesson here, I think. I think the Apostle Paul's spirit is so different than a lot of the manipulative requests that you sometimes see in our modern day era of religious people who are begging and pleading and cajoling us for funds. The Apostle Paul doesn't work like that. He doesn't run like that. He says, listen, I'm not speaking from want. I've learned to be content. I want us to focus on a word here, and the word is content. 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 Let that word hang there for just a moment. Do you think in our society that people in general are content? What do you think? No. First service didn't think so either. You guys are maybe more content than the first. I don't know, but we're not, are we? We are a very discontented society. And can we just acknowledge that? Can we acknowledge as Americans, we live in consumeristic America, and it's hard to be content, isn't it? I mean, every store you walk in, there's 10,000 items you can buy from. And think about it. Every time we watch the television, every commercial, we are marketed and plugged to death. About you need this, you want this, you should buy this, you deserve this. Right? Might explain why our credit cards are so maxed out. The idea of delayed gratification, the idea of being content, it's extremely difficult, and it's difficult for all of us, and no wonder it is. I appreciate what they've termed as the builder generation. The older generation among us, you grandmas and grandpas and great-grandmas and grandpas, you lived in an era where you learned and practiced delayed gratification. And the generations after haven't picked up on that very well, by and large. And when you talk to the older generation, they'll talk about how, when we were young, we were poor, but we didn't know it because everybody was in that boat. But in our society, in our day, it's not that way. We play the comparison game, and we can see our neighbors driving nicer cars than ourselves. And we see our workmates or kids at school who have fancier shoes or the latest brand name on their jeans, and we don't. And it's hard to be content when you do the comparison thing. And the Apostle Paul says, I've learned to be content. You ought to underline the words I've learned. He's going to use them a little bit later in this passage as well. Notice what he says, I have learned to be content. Now, I don't know about you, but that brings a lot of hope to me. What Paul is saying is contentment is a learned trait. We can learn to be content. It's not natural. It's not innate. As a matter of fact, it's not natural, it's supernatural. And I think we have to work at it if we want to learn to be content. but it can be learned. And anything that can be learned can be taught. Parents, one of the best lessons you could ever teach your children is delayed gratification. Helping them to learn to be content instead of helping them to buy everything they want and showering them with everything they think they need. Content. Paul says, I've learned to be content. And if he learned it, you and I can learn it as well. But in order to do that, sometimes we might have to adapt how we think, which brings me to the third quality, an adaptable spirit. I think when we have a thankful spirit and a content spirit, I think we're on the road to having the right spirit within us that David talked about in the Psalm. But in order to do that, we're going to have a flexible spirit, an adaptable spirit. And I love what the Apostle Paul says in verse 12. If only we all could get a hold of this lesson. Look what he says. I know how to get along with humble means. And he says, I also know how to live in prosperity. He says, in any and every circumstance, here's the word again, I have learned to be content. I've learned the secret of being filled. I've learned how to go hungry. He said, both having abundance and suffering need. He says, once again, I have learned that. Question, how do you think he learned it? How do you think he learned it? It's doubtful to me that he read it in a book and he just learned it. I think this is a lesson that we often get through experience, life experience. And sometimes someone said, life is the best teacher. I think that's true. One guy said, yeah, life's the best teacher. School of Hard Knocks is a good school. The problem is the tuition's just so high. I would agree with that. How about you? I'd kind of rather learn from somebody else's mistakes so I don't have to make them myself, you know what I mean? But the Apostle Paul learned to be adaptable. He says, in any and every circumstance. Kind of reminds you of what he said in chapter 1. In Philippians 1, verse 12. He says, I want you to know, brothers, he was speaking about his imprisonment. He says, I want you to know that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. I just love his adaptability. He's saying basically, no matter what happens to me in any and every circumstance, I refuse to let that circumstance steal my joy. I'm going to go with the flow. I'm going to ride the wave. I'm going to flex, and I'm going to bend, and I'm going to adapt, and I'm going to make it to the end. I will do it, is his attitude. I like that theologian Hugh Downs, who said, a happy man is not a man with a certain set of circumstances, but a happy man is a man with a certain set of attitudes. And I believe that is so true. I want to read you a quote by a guy. His name is Art Berg. He says, I discovered a long time ago that my happiness is not a condition of my circumstances. Rather, happiness is a choice. And he says, I make it every day. While we cannot control the environment of change that is happening all around us, we can control how we respond to it. We can adapt. We can change. And we can still find happiness no matter how dark the storms around us. That's the Apostle Paul. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of having abundance. I know how to live with a lot. And he says, I know how to get along with little. Sometimes life is a tough teacher, but sometimes life is a good teacher. I learned this in my own life at one season. It was several years ago. We lived right in this area. And matter of fact, I lived in O'Fallon. And I was working at another church. And as was my habit, I was out calling, and I called back into the office, and I asked my secretary, will you check my voicemail to see if there are any urgent needs or anything I need to take care of before I get back to the office, because it's going to be a while before I get back there, as she did. And she came back and got on the phone, and she says, Bob, you need to get in the office right now. What? You need to get in the office right now. And I'm like, okay, what's the urgency? Just tell me what's on the voicemail. I can't. There are too many years. Now she's really got me thinking. I'm like, what in the world is so critical that I got to get back there right now, and she can't talk about it because there's too many ears in the room? I mean, all kinds of things were going through my mind. Well, there's a backstory to that voicemail. Several months prior, I had conducted a seminar, and a group came in, and one of the guys in the group who worked in an office that was short a manager in their office, regional office, put my name in the hat for the position. And he emailed me and said, hey, my bosses would like to talk to you about considering this position. I took that email, I went home, I shared it with my wife, and her words, very matter-of-factly, were, I'm not moving. I thought, wow, there's a lot of elbow room in that statement. So I was like, okay, message received. Happy wife, happy life. And so I just ignored it, and I wrote him back and said, thanks, Steve, but no thanks. A few weeks later, I get another email. Hey, we'd really like you to submit a resume. I said, Steve, I already told you thanks, but no thanks. Another week went by, I get another email. Still pushing. He's not taking no for an answer. He's going to be a good salesman. And that led up to the voicemail. And I got back and I listened to the voicemail. And they said, Bob, you're on our short list. We have 3 top candidates and you're on our short list. I'm like, I'm on a list. How did I get on? I've been on a lot of lists in my day. Some of them not so good, some of them so good, you know. But I didn't even submit a resume. I haven't interviewed with anybody, and I'm on somebody's list. Now, that'll wake you up. But what they said next woke me up even worse. They said, and by the way, we've already discussed this with your 2 bosses. Oh, wait a minute. Now we're in trouble. I've not even put in a resume. I'm on somebody's list, and now my employers have been notified, and my wife ain't moving. I'm really in a hot box. Long story short, we moved. Never say never. My daughter found her husband because of that move. And my boys kind of found their life path and career because of that move. But let me tell you the other side of that story. I moved, and within 3 weeks or so, I can't remember the exact date, I think it was within 3 weeks, I get a phone call that says, we're going to have a reduction in force. We are going to give the axe to 15 people. And the man who hired me, my boss, was one of those people. I mean, when you're brand new and you just arrived and you just unloaded the truck and you think you're hearing reduction in force, I'm the first one to go. I think they just didn't have the heart to axe me right away. This was during the economic crisis, and within a year, my office shut down and was no longer in existence. I moved my family clear across the country, and now I'm without a job, and I've got a daughter who's engaged and wants to be married there, and I've got 2 boys that are about to enter into their senior year in high school, and I don't want to rip them out of that. So I said, okay, God, I'll do whatever it takes. Oh, he took that to heart. I had to do whatever it took. I worked every no-in, no-good, low-down, dirty job, part-time, because it was 2008. and there were no jobs to be had. I was willing to do whatever to get through that season. And here's what I found. I learned to be thankful. More thankful because my circumstances forced me to be that way. Not at the time. Sometimes there were some really low moments. I can't tell you how low. You ask any guy who's lost his job, how that hits you square in the heart. So there were moments where I was crying out, God, why me? Why now? Why this? But I remember one particular moment. I received a paycheck. I was working part-time in 2 or 3 places and some sideline jobs as well. And the 2-week paycheck was $300. That didn't come close to making my house payment, didn't come close to making my car payment. But I remember having some bills and thinking to myself, praise God, because that $300 just covers it. And what was weird, 6 months before, I was getting checks that were 10 times that amount, and I wasn't very grateful. I just took it for granted. I felt I deserved it. Sometimes God molds us by humbling us and bringing us down so he can lift us up. And we have to adapt. And in order to have a right spirit, sometimes we've got to have a reframing of our spirit. And we've got to learn to be more thankful. And we've got to learn to be more grateful. And Paul says, I've learned the secret of having plenty, and I've learned how to get along with little. I understand what he's talking about there. I get that. And that's a good thing sometimes when God takes us and he shakes us and he remolds us and he remakes us to be and to have the spirit he wants us to have. He said in Philippians 1, verse 12, he says, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. You know, it's easy to be positive when life is perfect. It's easy to be positive when you're coasting. But it's hard to be positive when life hits you hard. And that brings us to the next point. Paul had a source of strength. And he had a can-do spirit. Look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. He says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Have you ever run into anybody who, for lack of a better term, is just a negative Nelly? You ever run into those kind? You ever work with those kind? You have any in your family that are that kind? I mean, they're the kind of people that they can just siphon the joy out of a room in about 2 seconds flat. One guy calls them vision vampires. They just suck the life right out of you. They're just negative Nelly, and no matter what you say or what you do or what you try to do, they've got a reason why you can't. There are people that just can't do people. It can't be done. It's too hard. Do this, do that. And you can't do it. You ever run into those? When I do, I kind of go like this. Get thee behind me, Satan. You know what I'm talking about? Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. He's got a can-do spirit. And if you want to have a can-do spirit, you want to kind of avoid the can't-do people. And you got to not listen to them. But sometimes the can't-do person is, guess who? Ourselves. Sometimes we're our worst enemy. Sometimes we're afraid to venture out and try things. We're afraid to take a step of faith because in our minds, fear enters in and it tells us we can't do it. The Apostle Paul said, I can do all things. I love to study historical figures. One of them is Henry Ford. Henry Ford made this statement. He said, I am looking for a lot of men who have an infinite capacity to not know what can't be done. I like his attitude. I'm looking for a lot of people who have the infinite capacity to not know what can't be done. But this isn't just positive thinking. Paul says, I can do all things, but his source was Christ, through him who strengthens me. Philippians 1, verse 21, Paul says, for to me to live is Christ. I quoted you a quote just a little bit earlier by a guy by the name of Art Berg. I want to tell you a little more about him. I didn't know much about this guy. I had never heard of him until I read about him. December 26, 1983, at the age of 21, Art Berg broke his neck in a serious automobile accident, leaving him a quadriplegic. But he refused to let that stop him. Since that time, he's been recognized by 3 national sales awards. Art was the president of Invictus Communications, Inc. and eSpeakers.com, Inc. In 94, Art was featured in Success Magazine as one of the greatest comebacks of the year. He achieved the highest earned designation of Certified Speaking Professional. He's in the Speakers Hall of Fame, a status achieved by fewer than 1% of professional speakers. Art married the 1992 Mrs. Utah, and they have 2 children. He was a world-class, I love this one, a world-class wheelchair athlete who enjoyed a variety of sports, including, now get this, full contact wheelchair rugby. I didn't even know it existed. I can't picture it. Full contact wheelchair rugby. I just see wheels flying everywhere. What an interesting thing. On July 10th, 1993, he set a world record by becoming the first quadriplegic at his level of ability to race an ultra marathon, 325 miles between Salt Lake City, Utah, and St. George, Utah. He also authored 2 best-selling books, one entitled Some Miracles Take Time and Finding Peace in Troubled Waters. He traveled more than 200,000 miles a year, speaking to hundreds of professional and civic organizations, IBM, 3M, Sun Microsystems, American Express, AT&T, Coca-Cola, GTE, Sony, the list goes on. His theme, the impossible just takes a little longer. The difficult takes time, he loved to say, and the impossible, it just takes a little longer. What an inspiration of somebody who had a can-do spirit. My encouragement to you is, don't let fear seep into your soul and tell you you can't do it. Paul said, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I began this sermon with a scripture, Psalm 51, verse 10, that King David cried out in crisis, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. I think David understood having a right spirit begins and ends with a right relationship with God. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. When he said that, there were some things in his life that weren't right, and he knew it. and he had to get right with God before he could be right with the world. I don't know. Maybe, possibly, you could be where he was. Maybe not. Maybe you're right and you're good. If that's the case, praise God. I'm going to ask us to stand this morning, and the band's going to come, and they've picked a song that really goes with this concept that we've been talking about, having a right heart before God. And if you need to get something right with God, I can't think of a better time to do that than right here and now. We're going to have some prayer counselors in the back. I'll ask some people to come up front. And just feel free. It's a safe thing to do. If you need prayer this morning, or you need to talk to somebody about where you're at spiritually, feel free to do that as we sing this song together. Just move out of your chairs and seek someone out. Our spiritual counselors will be glad to pray with you. They'll be glad to help you in any way that you need help this morning.